They haven't argued in 8 months, and everyone keeps telling her that's the good news. She just can't tell anymore if what's left in the room is peace, or the sound of two people who quit.
Dear Mia.
Episode 1. We stopped fighting.
Y Mia.
Before we start, one honest thing. I'm not a therapist, and nothing here is a substitute for one. What I am is someone who's spent years writing and living the long, unglamorous middle of marriages, the part after the wedding and before whatever comes next. So take this as one person's honest attempt at an answer, not a professional prescription. Let's get into today's letter.
Dear Mia.
My husband and I used to fight. Not constantly, but regularly, about money, about his mother, about whose turn it was to deal with the thing nobody wants to deal with. It was exhausting, and for a long time I thought that exhaustion was the problem. Then, about 8 months ago, we just stopped. We don't fight anymore. Everything is calm. Everyone I mention this to says that's wonderful, that we finally figured it out. But it doesn't feel like we figured anything out. It feels like we just stopped bothering. I don't know how to explain the difference to anyone, including myself. Is this what a healthy marriage is supposed to feel like? Because it mostly just feels quiet in a way I can't tell is peace or something else. Some nights we sit in the same room for an hour, each on our own phone, and it's comfortable in the moment, but I go to bed feeling like I spent the evening near him instead of with him. I keep waiting for one of us to say something that breaks the quiet, and neither of us ever does.
Okay.
First, I want to say clearly that you already answered your own question in the way you asked it. You used the word quiet 3 times in that letter, and you didn't use the word close once. That's not an accusation, it's just data, and it's worth sitting with before we go any further, because most people who write to me with a question like this already know the answer somewhere underneath the question. They're not asking me to tell them something new. They're asking me to give them permission to trust what they already suspect. Here's the thing about fighting that nobody tells you when you're in the exhausting middle of it. Fighting, the ordinary, regular kind you're describing about money, about his mother, about chores, is very often just two people insisting, in the only language they have left, that the relationship still matters enough to argue about. It's a clumsy, exhausting way of saying, I still expect something from you. It's not good communication. It's not what anyone should aim for. But it is underneath the noise a form of engagement. Two people who have truly stopped caring about the outcome of a disagreement don't fight about it. They just let it go because it costs them nothing to let it go, because they've quietly downgraded how much they expect from each other. Conflict, for all its unpleasantness, requires both people to still believe the outcome is worth the discomfort of pursuing it. That belief is actually a form of investment, even when it doesn't feel like one from the inside. I've heard some version of this letter more times than almost any other question I get, and it usually arrives wearing a costume of relief. We finally stopped fighting, because on paper it sounds like the couple graduated. Friends say, congratulations. In-laws say they always knew you two would settle down. Nobody outside a marriage can hear the difference between the silence of resolution and the silence of retreat, because from a dinner party across the table, both look like a calm couple who gets along. Only the two people inside the marriage know which one they're actually living in, and even they sometimes need months, like you have, to notice the difference, because withdrawal doesn't arrive with an alarm. It arrives one skipped argument at a time, each one individually reasonable. I was tired. It wasn't worth it. I didn't want to ruin the evening, until 8 months have gone by, and the reasonable choices have quietly added up to something nobody chose on purpose. So the real question isn't, did the fighting stop? It's what replaced the thing the fighting used to be about. If what replaced it is actual resolution, you talked it through, you found a system for the money, you set a real boundary with his mother, you split the chores in a way you both actually accept, then congratulations, you did figure it out, and the quiet is peace. That version of quiet has a particular texture to it, and I want to describe it so you can compare it honestly against what you actually have. It feels light, not careful. You can bring up something mildly annoying without rehearsing it first. You still occasionally disagree about small things, whose turn it is to call the plumber, whether you're overspending on groceries, and those small disagreements resolve in an afternoon instead of festering, because neither of you is stockpiling grievances anymore. You're actually spending them as they come up. That's what real resolution sounds like from the inside. It has friction in it. Boring, ordinary, low-stakes friction, the kind two engaged people produce just by living close together and still caring what the other one thinks. But if what replaced the fighting is silence because raising it doesn't feel worth the energy anymore, because you've each quietly decided the other one probably won't change, so why bother? That's not peace. That's two people who've stopped expecting anything from each other, which can look identical to peace from the outside and feels completely different from the inside, which is exactly what you're describing. This kind of quiet has a different texture too, and it matches what you told me about the two of you sitting in the same room, each on your own phone, comfortable in the moment and lonely by bedtime. That specific combination, comfortable in the moment, lonely in retrospect, is one of the clearest signals I know of. Real closeness doesn't usually produce loneliness afterward. Parallel coexistence does, because you were near each other the entire evening and connected to each other for almost none of it, and some part of you notices the gap even when nothing about the evening seemed wrong while it was happening. I want to name something else in your letter, gently, because I think it matters. You said you keep waiting for one of you to say something that breaks the quiet, and neither of you ever does. That's worth examining honestly, because waiting is not neutral. Waiting is a strategy, even when it doesn't feel like one. It's the strategy of hoping the other person will take the risk first, so you don't have to be the one who disrupts something that's at least calm, even if it isn't good. I understand the appeal of that strategy completely. Calm is genuinely more pleasant than conflict in the short term almost every single time. But calm that's being maintained by mutual avoidance isn't stable. It's just quiet in a way that's waiting for something to break it eventually, usually at a worse moment than the one you'd choose on purpose. A bigger blow-up down the road, or worse, no blow-up at all. Just a slow drift into two people who've built entirely separate inner lives inside the same house, and only notice how far apart they've drifted when something forces the question. A job offer in another city, an affair, someone finally saying out loud what they've been sitting on for years. Here's a way to actually check this week, not as a big dramatic conversation, just as an experiment. Bring up one small, real, current thing that mildly annoys you, not the biggest issue, just a real one, the way you would have 8 months ago before things went quiet. Maybe it's something small about money, or something about his mother, or just an honest, "It bothered me that you did the thing you did on Tuesday." Watch what happens next and watch it closely, because the information is usually in the first 30 seconds. If he engages, even a little defensively, even imperfectly, if his shoulders tense, if he says, "Well, what was I supposed to do?" If he pushes back even clumsily, that's actually a good sign. It means the wanting to work it out muscle is still there, just out of practice, the way any muscle gets stiff and awkward after 8 months of not being used, without meaning it's gone. If he goes flat instead, or changes the subject, or gives you a placating "you're right, sorry," that closes the conversation instead of opening it. Or if you find yourself not even wanting to finish the sentence because it doesn't feel worth it anymore, that flatness is the actual information you're looking for. Not as a verdict on the marriage, as a starting point for an actual conversation. Ideally not one you have alone in your own head for another 8 months. If the first experiment leaves you still unsure, there's a second one worth trying, a little bigger than the first. Ask him directly, without setting it up as a confrontation, what he thinks changed 8 months ago. Not "Are we okay?" which is a question built to be answered with a reflexive yes. Something more specific. "I've noticed we don't really disagree about anything anymore. Have you noticed that too? What do you think happened?" The way he answers that question will tell you almost as much as what he says. Does he think about it for a second, like it's something he's also been quietly aware of? Does he brush it off fast, a little too fast, like he'd rather the question hadn't been asked? Does he seem relieved you brought it up, the way people sometimes do when someone finally says the thing they've also been sitting on alone? All three of those are real, different answers, and each one points you toward a different next step. A thoughtful answer means you likely have a partner ready to have the fuller conversation with you. A too fast brush off might mean he's protecting the same fragile calm you are, out of the same fear you have, and needs a gentler, more patient approach than a single direct question. Relief usually means you're about to find out he's been carrying his own version of this letter for months, unsure how to bring it up either. There's also a pattern worth naming honestly because I hear versions of it constantly, and it doesn't always look the way people expect. It's not always the same partner who initiates the quiet, but it's very often one partner who notices it first the way you have, while the other one experiences the same 8 months as simple relief. Finally, the fighting stopped, things are easier now. Why go looking for a problem in something that finally feels calm? That mismatch isn't anyone's fault. But it does mean the two of you may currently be living in what feel like two different marriages under the same roof. Yours, quietly worried about a loneliness he may not have registered at all, and his, genuinely relieved that the friction of the last few years has eased. Neither experience is wrong, but they can't both stay true forever without someone eventually naming the gap between them. Because a marriage where one person is grieving something the other person hasn't noticed is missing tends to keep drifting in whatever direction the person who isn't paying attention is comfortable with, simply because nobody's steering against it. I want to offer you a small piece of something I've noticed, having spent a long time now writing and thinking about the unglamorous middle stretch of marriages, the years after the wedding photos stop getting looked at, and before whatever comes next. The couples who worry me most are almost never the ones who are still fighting, even when the fighting looks ugly from the outside. The ones who worry me are the ones who describe exactly what you just described to me. A sudden, unexplained calm, arriving out of nowhere after a long stretch of friction, that everyone around them praises as maturity. Real maturity in a marriage usually looks like fighting less often but resolving faster. Not fighting hardly ever because nothing feels worth raising anymore. I've talked to enough people, over enough years, on the other side of a marriage that ended quietly rather than loudly, to know that almost none of them describe a single dramatic moment where it broke. They describe exactly this, a long, comfortable, well-praised quiet, that in hindsight was actually the sound of two people slowly stopping their case for each other, one skipped argument at a time, until the case had been closed for so long neither of them remembered when they'd stopped making it. One woman told me, years after her divorce, that the hardest part to explain to people was that nothing had happened. No affair, no single blow-up anyone could point to. Just a long quiet she'd once described to a friend, almost proudly, as we finally stopped fighting, the exact same sentence you used in your letter, and she said if she could go back, she'd want someone to have asked her, right around month 8, whether the quiet felt like peace or like something else. There are also smaller, more physical signs worth paying attention to alongside the conversational ones, because withdrawal doesn't only show up in what does or doesn't get said out loud. Notice whether you still reach for each other in small, unremarkable ways, a hand on a shoulder passing in the kitchen, sitting closer than you have to on the couch even when there's room to spread out, the kind of casual touch that doesn't mean anything on its own but tends to disappear first, quietly, when two people start drifting, long before either of them would say out loud that anything's wrong. Notice whether you still tell him about your day in any real detail, or whether you've started giving the shorthand version because the full version doesn't feel like it lands the way it used to. Notice whether either of you still asks the other genuinely curious questions, not "how is work," which anyone can answer on autopilot, but something that requires him to actually know what you've been carrying lately in order to ask it well. None of these things, missing on any single evening, means anything at all, but missing consistently, across weeks, the way you're describing across months, tends to travel together with exactly the kind of quiet you wrote to me about. I don't say that to frighten you, and I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to hear that story and spiral into thinking 8 quiet months means your marriage is doomed. It doesn't. Most marriages pass through stretches of quiet that mean nothing at all, a busy season at work, a hard year with a kid, sheer exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much two people love each other. The difference isn't the quiet itself. It's whether the quiet is sitting on top of continued closeness or sitting where closeness used to be. I say it because I think you're standing at a genuinely useful fork in the road, earlier than most people get to see it, and that's actually good news buried inside an uncomfortable letter. You noticed. 8 months in, you noticed, and you wrote to a stranger about it instead of letting another 8 months pass unexamined, which tells me something real about how much this marriage still matters to you, even in its current quiet state. That noticing is not nothing. People who have genuinely checked out don't usually sit down and write a careful, specific letter describing the exact texture of their loneliness. They just quietly start making other plans. You're not there. You're at the point where the alarm has gone off softly enough that you could still ignore it if you wanted to, and you're choosing not to ignore it instead. That's the version of this story, with the most options still open to you. I also want to gently push back on one thing, because I think it's worth saying out loud. Don't mistake this for a problem you have to solve entirely on your own, quietly, before bringing him into it. It's tempting to treat a letter like this one as a private diagnostic tool. Figure out on your own whether it's peace or retreat, and only loop him in once you've reached a conclusion. But a marriage is, by definition, a two-person project, and a diagnosis you reach entirely alone, however accurate, is still just your half of the picture. He may be sitting on his own version of this exact letter right now, unsent, unshown to anyone, wondering the same thing about the same 8 months from his own angle. You won't know that until you ask, and asking is a different act than deciding. There's a temptation, when a marriage has gone quiet like this, to do all your worrying alone first. Turn it over for weeks, build the case, decide what's wrong and what needs to change, and only then present him with a conclusion. I understand the instinct. It feels safer to know what you think before you say anything. But a marriage that's gone quiet because you've each stopped expecting things from each other doesn't usually get fixed by one person doing all the emotional work alone and then delivering a verdict. It needs both of you back in a room, curious about the same question at the same time, which is part of why this small experiment matters more than a fully formed speech would. You're not trying to arrive at him with an answer. You're trying to arrive at him with a real question, one you're actually willing to sit in the uncertainty of together. And if it turns out the flatness is real, if you try the small thing this week and he goes quiet in the wrong way, the disengaged way rather than the defensive way, I don't want you to treat that as the end of the story either. It's information, not a verdict. Plenty of marriages have gone through exactly this stretch, a long quiet slide neither person quite chose, and come out the other side once someone finally said the uncomfortable thing out loud instead of waiting for the other person to say it first. What tends to determine which way it goes isn't whether the marriage went quiet in the first place. A lot of long marriages go through a quiet stretch like this at some point, often around the same pressures you mentioned, money and family, and the accumulated weight of who does what. What tends to determine which way it goes is whether someone eventually says out loud, "I notice the quiet and I don't think it's the good kind, and I want to find out together what kind it actually is." You don't have to know the answer before you say that sentence. You just have to be willing to ask it. One more practical thought, because I don't want to leave you with just a single week's experiment and nothing beyond it. Give this a real runway, not a one-shot test. Try the small, honest thing this week and pay attention to how he responds. Then try it again the following week about something else small and real, and again the week after that. You're not looking for one perfect data point. You're looking for a pattern. The same way the quiet itself became a pattern over 8 months rather than arriving all at once. If, after a month of genuinely trying this, bringing up real small things, watching how he meets them, you're seeing more engagement than flatness, that's a marriage finding its way back toward each other, and it's worth trusting that direction even if it's slow. If, after a month, you're mostly still meeting flatness, or you notice yourself quietly giving up on the experiment because it feels pointless, that's worth taking seriously as its own kind of answer, and it may be time to say the bigger thing out loud together, possibly with someone trained to help two people find their way back to each other when neither one quite knows how to start. There's no shame in that. Plenty of good marriages have needed a third person in the room at some point, not because anything catastrophic happened, but because 8 months of quiet is a hard thing for two people to talk their way out of alone, especially when both of you are a little afraid of what you'll find if you look too closely. You already know the difference between quiet and peace. You've been describing it perfectly this entire letter, in the specific words you chose without even meaning to choose them. Trust that instinct more than you trust the compliments from people who only see the outside of it, and trust it more than you trust the comfort of another calm, uneventful evening on separate phones in the same room. The version of you that noticed the difference and wrote this letter is the version of you that still wants a marriage worth being loud about sometimes. Don't let 8 more months of comfortable, quiet talk that version of you back to sleep. That's this week's letter.
Ay, Mia. Talk soon.